The most arrogant man in the company was shaken by what my 7-year-old son said about him in front of everyone. To see how a child's sincerity can crush arrogant people, subscribe to the channel. It may be just a click for you, but it's a great incentive for our team to continue searching for and bringing you these incredible stories. Comment on the city you're watching from, and stay until the end, because this story will surprise you. My name is Rachel, I'm 43 years old, and for a long time, I believed that being invisible was my only way to survive in this cutthroat corporate world. Every morning, I wake up at 5:30 in my small Chicago apartment, the sound of my alarm clock cutting through the silence like a cold blade. Leo, my 7-year-old son, still sleeps soundly in his superhero poster-decorated room, oblivious to the daily battles I wage to keep our life stable. I've been a single mother for 5 years, ever since David decided that the responsibility of a family didn't align with his dreams of freedom. Since then, each day has been a test of endurance, each bill paid a small victory, and each denied promotion a wound I learned to mask with a professional smile. Breakfast is always quick: toast for Leo, black coffee for me, and a race against the clock that never seems to be in our favor. As I pack his lunchbox and check his backpack, I feel the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on my shoulders. I don't have the luxury of having bad days or falling apart. Leo relies on me, and that's both my strength and my greatest vulnerability. At Hartwell & Associates, a mid-size consulting firm where I've worked for 8 years, I've become an expert at being competent without being seen. I arrive at the office every day at 7:30, always among the first, and watch the city awaken through the 12th floor windows. Chicago pulsates below, full of ambition and opportunities that always seem just a step away from my reality. My desk is in the right-hand corner of the strategy department, a position that gives me a privileged view of the entire office dynamic, but also keeps me subtly removed from the center of important decisions. For years, I built my reputation quietly: projects delivered on time, impeccable reports, analyses that saved the company from disastrous decisions. Yet, when the credit is distributed, my name rarely appears in the final presentations or in the congratulatory emails circulated around the board. I learned to accept this as part of the game, convincing myself that occasional competence would be recognized, that dedication would be rewarded, that invisibility was only temporary. But as the years passed and I watched less experienced colleagues rise through the ranks, a restlessness began to grow in my chest. Yet I never complained, never confronted, never demanded what I knew I deserved. It was in this environment that I met Mark Peterson, a 38-year-old who arrived at the company 3 years ago with the charm of someone born to sell dreams. Tall, with an easy smile and a confidence that seemed to emanate naturally from every gesture, Mark quickly became the darling of the board and the center of attention at any meeting. He had a gift for transforming mediocre ideas into brilliant presentations, for making superficial connections seem like deep relationships, and for subtly appropriating the work of others so elegantly that even his victims began to doubt their own contributions. I watched over those 3 years as he built his reputation on the work of others, always crediting team collaborations when questioned, but never mentioning specific names. His most brilliant ideas were often adaptations or improvements of concepts that others had developed in informal meetings or hallway conversations. Mark had an almost supernatural ability to be present at the right moments, to ask the right questions, and to transform other people's insights into personal achievements. I was one of his favorite sources, although he would never openly admit it. Our interactions began seemingly innocently. Mark would seek me out to bounce ideas on projects, always praising my analytical perspective and my ability to see details others missed. "Rachel, you have a brilliant mind for strategy," he'd say, leaning across my desk with that smile I hadn't yet learned to distrust. Initially, I was flattered by the attention from someone so well regarded in the company, and I naively shared ideas, insights, and even draft proposals I was developing. Mark always listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and made me feel valued in a way I rarely experienced in the workplace. However, weeks later, I would often hear echoes of these same ideas coming out of his mouth in important meetings, presented as insights he'd developed independently. When I tried to mention my contribution, he'd smile and say something like, "Oh, yes, Rachel and I discussed this briefly. She made some interesting observations. Interesting observations. As if years of experience and deep analysis could be reduced to casual comments. Gradually, I learned to keep my best ideas to myself, but the damage to my self-esteem was already done. For the past 6 months, I've been working on the most important project of my career at Hartwell, a comprehensive process restructuring proposal for our largest client, Thomson Industries. This project represents not only an opportunity to demonstrate my strategic prowess, but also a chance to finally emerge from the invisibility that has defined my professional trajectory. I've dedicated countless hours analyzing data, identifying inefficiencies, and developing innovative solutions that could save the client millions while significantly increasing our profit margin. Every spreadsheet has been reviewed dozens of times, every chart carefully crafted, and every recommendation backed by rigorous analysis and market benchmarks. Leo spent many nights doing homework at the kitchen table while I worked on my laptop, occasionally coming over to give me a hug and ask if I was okay. "Mommy's working on something really important," I'd tell him, and he'd nod with the seriousness of a child who understands more than he should about the pressures of adulthood. This project is my gamble, my chance to prove that years of quiet competence finally deserve to be recognized. On Tuesday, I have my big presentation to the board. What I didn't know, as I worked obsessively on this project, was that significant changes were happening behind the scenes at Hartwell. Margaret Sullivan, our department manager for over a decade, had quietly communicated to the board her intention to retire at the end of the year. Margaret had always been a respected but distant figure, someone who managed effectively but rarely engaged deeply in the individual development of her team. Her departure would create a significant power vacuum, an opportunity one hadn't even known existed. Several names were already being floated around as potential successors, and Mark Peterson was among the favorites, thanks to his visibility and the widespread perception that he was a player capable of leading a team. The irony was not lost on me. While I worked tirelessly to prove my worth through concrete results, Mark was building his candidacy through politics and presence. The familiar dynamics of corporate life, where substance often loses out to style, where competence is less valued than the ability to self-promote. As I prepared for the presentation that could change my career, unseen forces were already shaping a future I couldn't imagine. On this Sunday night, as I review my presentation for the last time and Leo sleeps peacefully in his room, I feel a mixture of anxiety and hope that perfectly defines my existence. Tomorrow, Monday, will be just another day of preparation, but Tuesday could be the beginning of a new phase in my life. I look out the window at the lights of Chicago twinkling in the darkness and allow myself to dream of a future where my competence is finally recognized, where Leo can be proud of his mother not only for her dedication but for her success. I cannot imagine that, in less than 48 hours, my life will be turned upside down in a way I could never have foreseen. I cannot foresee that the humiliation that awaits me will be catalyzed by the very person I trusted, nor that revenge will come through the innocent words of my son. In this moment of calm before the storm, I am just Rachel, a hardworking woman trying to build a better life for her family, a woman who still believes that justice prevails for those who work hard and maintain integrity. Tomorrow, that innocence will begin to die, but something much stronger will be born in its place. Tuesday arrived like a hurricane disguised as a gentle breeze. I woke at 5 in the morning, 2 hours before my usual alarm, my heart pounding in a rhythm that seemed to echo throughout the silent apartment. Leo was still fast asleep, hugging his faded teddy bear, oblivious to the storm of nervousness consuming his mother just a few feet away. I got up carefully, trying not to make a sound, and headed to the bathroom where I spent 20 minutes staring at myself in the mirror, practicing facial expressions and gestures that would convey the confidence I desperately needed. I chose my navy blue blazer, the one that always made me feel more professional and powerful, and a white blouse Leo had helped me choose weeks ago, telling me it made me look important like the women on TV. As I applied my makeup, I mentally replayed the key points of my presentation, every statistic, every graph, every recommendation I had polished to perfection. My reflection in the mirror showed a determined woman, but my eyes betrayed the vulnerability I was desperately trying to hide. Today would be the day I finally emerged from the shadows, or at least that's what I believed with all the strength of my hopeful heart. Breakfast was a careful reenactment of normalcy. Leo, ever perceptive, noticed my tension and tried to cheer me up with jokes he'd learned in school, his childish laughter echoing through the kitchen like little rays of sunshine amidst my internal storm. "Mommy, you're going to rock today," he said, using an expression I'd heard in a movie, and I felt a wave of love so intense it almost made me cry right there. I explained to him that I had a very important meeting at work and that I might be home a little late. "You'll win, Mommy. You always win when it matters," he replied with the absolute conviction only children possess, and I wished I had half the faith he had in my success. On the way to school, I held his hand a little tighter than usual, absorbing his positive energy like a talisman against the challenges that awaited me. As I dropped him off at the school gate, he turned and shouted, "Go, Super Mommy." And for a moment, I actually felt invincible. The office was in its usual morning routine when I arrived, but for me, everything felt charged with a special electricity. I greeted my colleagues with a wider smile than usual, feeling more upright, more present, as if my usual invisibility had dissipated overnight. Margaret Sullivan stopped by my desk around 9 o'clock and wished me good luck with a nod, a rare gesture from her, which I interpreted as a positive sign. Mark arrived around 9:30, flashing his usual smile and greeting everyone with the ease of someone born to be the center of attention. When our eyes met, he gave me a thumbs up and said, "Great day today, Rachel. I'm sure it will be a memorable presentation." There was something in his tone I couldn't quite decipher, a nuance that seemed odd, but I attributed it to my own anxiety. I spent the morning making final checks on my presentation, testing equipment, organizing printed copies of the reports, every detail checked and rechecked until it was perfect. At 11:30, Margaret called me into her office for a quick chat, where she confirmed the presentation schedule and assured me that the board was eager to hear my recommendations. Hartwell and Associates' main conference room had never seemed so intimidating. At 2 p.m. sharp, I entered the room I usually only noticed in passing, with its glass walls, polished mahogany table, and leather chairs that resembled corporate thrones. The board of directors was already present: Richard Hartwell, the company's founder and president, Linda Chin, CFO, David Brooks, COO, and Margaret Sullivan, who introduced me with flattering words that warmed my heart. Also present were some department colleagues, including Mark, who positioned himself strategically at the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and that enigmatic smile I still couldn't interpret. I connected my laptop to the projector with hands that trembled imperceptibly, took a deep breath, and began the presentation with a confidence I had cultivated over weeks of preparation. My voice sounded clear and firm as I introduced the project, explained the analysis methodology, and began unfolding the findings that could revolutionize the operations of our largest client. For the first 15 minutes, I felt in complete control, watching the attentive faces of the board, seeing nods of approval, finally feeling like I was being seen, recognized, valued. It was when I got to the slide on human resource optimization that everything began to fall apart. I was explaining how a strategic job reshuffling could increase productivity by 23% when Mark pushed away from the wall and interrupted with an "Excuse me, Rachel," in a tone that sounded polite but carried an underlying arrogance that made my stomach churn. "I need to question some of the fundamental assumptions of this analysis," he continued, walking toward the center of the room as if he were the main presenter. I felt my confidence instantly waver, but I tried to maintain my composure. "Of course, Marf. What specific aspects would you like me to clarify?" I replied, still hoping for a legitimate question I could answer competently. But what came next was a systematic and calculated attack. "Well, for starters, these economic projections seem overly optimistic. You're basing your calculations on market benchmarks that may not be applicable to Thompson Industries specifically." He paused, looking around the room as if including the board in his superior analysis. "Furthermore, their restructuring recommendations completely ignore the political and cultural complexities that anyone with real experience in change management would know are critical." Every word was a stab disguised as constructive criticism. Mark's attack continued with a surgical brutality that left me completely disarmed. "Rachel, you've clearly put a lot of time into this project," he said, his tone condescending and making my face burn with humiliation, "but there's a difference between effort and expertise. These financial analyses, for example, look like the work of someone who's never actually implemented a large-scale restructuring." He pointed to my charts as if they were child's drawings, explaining to the board, who were now watching me with increasingly skeptical expressions, how my approach was academically interesting, but practically naive. "The numbers she's presenting here," he continued, picking up one of the printouts and waving it in the air, "show a limited fundamental understanding of how these transformations actually work in the real world. It's the kind of analysis you'd expect from someone who's never left a spreadsheet." Mark looked directly at me with that smile I now recognized as predatory. "It's not your fault, Rachel. You simply don't have the experience necessary to understand the nuances of a project of this magnitude." The room was completely silent, and I could feel the weight of all the eyes on me, judging, questioning, doubting every word I had said. My voice was gone completely. It was as if my throat had closed up, and I stood there, unable to defend myself, unable to fight back, just absorbing the public humiliation. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment that felt like an eternity, no one moved, no one spoke, and I stood there, in the center of the company's most important conference room, feeling smaller than I ever had in my entire professional life. Tears threatened to well up in my eyes, but I fought them back with all my remaining strength, refusing to give Mark the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Richard Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably and said, "Well, perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss these additional considerations." Linda Chin closed her briefcase with a sharp thud that echoed through the room like a gavel. Margaret Sullivan avoided my gaze, and I could see the disappointment in her posture. One by one, the board members began to get up and leave the room, murmuring among themselves in low tones that I knew were about me, about my incompetence, about how they had wasted their time listening to an amateur presentation. Mark stayed until the end, arranging his papers with deliberately slow movements, savoring every second of my destruction. When we were finally alone, he approached me and said, almost gently, "Rachel, you're a lovely person and a dedicated employee. But leadership is for people with a broader vision." Then he walked out, leaving me alone in the conference room, surrounded by the wreckage of my career and my dignity, unaware that the worst, and paradoxically, the best, was yet to come. I left the conference room like a ghost walking among the living, each step weighing like molten lead on my feet. My body moved on autopilot as my mind tried to process the magnitude of the humiliation I had just suffered. I walked through the Hartwell halls as if navigating a nightmare, aware of the furtive glances of colleagues who had already heard the whispers about my disastrous presentation. Some looked away when our paths crossed, others offered awkward smiles of false sympathy, but no one approached to offer a word of support or consolation. I reached my desk and collapsed into my chair, feeling as if my inner structure had been completely demolished. The computer screens around me seemed blurry, the sounds of the office reached me like distant echoes, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I would faint right there, in front of everyone. I took a deep breath, trying to regain some control over my involuntarily trembling body, and that's when I remembered Leo was there, at the company, waiting for me in the small play area Hartwell maintains for employees' children during emergencies or school leave. The last thing I wanted was for my son to see me in this state of utter devastation. Leo had missed school that day due to a mild stomach bug. Nothing serious, but enough that I decided to bring him to work with me rather than leave him alone at home. Hartwell had a progressive policy that allowed employees to bring their children in special situations, and there was a small area with books, toys, and a television where children could spend the day if needed. During the morning, Leo had been perfectly behaved, coloring pictures and reading his favorite comics, occasionally coming to my desk to show me his drawings or ask for a snack. He knew some of my colleagues by sight, including Mark, who was always especially charming around children, making jokes and offering candy with that smile that I now knew was a carefully constructed mask. Leo, with the natural confidence of children, enjoyed these interactions and considered Mark the funny man at Mommy's work. What I didn't know was that during my presentation, Leo had left the play area and wandered the hallways, eventually finding a position where he could observe some of what was happening in the conference room through the glass walls. My son, even at 7, had a keen sense of emotions, and he must have sensed that something terrible was happening to his mother. I tried to compose myself, discreetly wiping away the tears that stubbornly escaped my eyes, when I saw Leo approaching my desk with hesitant steps. His small face was etched with a concern that broke my heart. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to worry about his mother's suffering. "Mommy, are you okay?" he asked in that sweet, direct voice only children possess, and I had to bite my lip to keep from bursting into tears again. "I'm fine, honey," I lied, trying to smile convincingly. "I'm just a little tired from the meeting." Leo watched me with those large, expressive eyes that seemed to see far more than a child should be able to. "That man was mean to you," he said, and it wasn't a question, but an observation. My son had witnessed my humiliation, and the pain of that realization was almost unbearable. "Sometimes adults disagree about work, Leo. It's no big deal," I tried to explain, but he shook his head with a determination that surprised me. "He was bad," he repeated, and then, before I could stop him, he marched toward the center of the office with a determination that filled me with dread. Mark was standing near the coffee machine, surrounded by a few colleagues who were probably listening to his version of the meeting's events, when Leo approached with the determined gait of a child on a mission. I quickly rose from my chair, trying to reach him before he did anything that might make my situation even worse, but Leo was quick and driven by a childish indignation that propelled him forward. I watched, horrified and fascinated at the same time, as my 7-year-old son planted himself directly in front of Mark Peterson, interrupting his conversation with an authority that would have been comical under other circumstances. "Mr. Mark," Leo said in a clear voice that cut through the surrounding conversations, causing several heads to turn in their direction. Mark looked down with that condescending smile he used with children, clearly expecting some innocent comment or request for candy. "Hi, Leo. How are you, champ?" he replied, still unaware of the bombshell that was about to explode. What happened next changed everything. Leo, with the brutal honesty only children possess, and without fully grasping the political implications of his words, blurted out information I hadn't even known he'd heard. "Why were you mean to my mommy if she's going to be your boss?" The silence that followed Leo's question was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but a complete suspension of reality, as if time had stopped to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Mark, who a second before had displayed his usual confidence, stood completely still, his face shifting between expressions ranging from confusion to horror, as if he were slowly processing the meaning of Leo's words. The colleagues around the coffee machine froze in their positions, cups suspended in mid-sentence, conversations interrupted mid-sentence, all trying to comprehend what a 7-year-old had just revealed about the company's power structure. Leo, oblivious to the chaos he had unleashed, continued with the relentless logic of childhood. "The man in the nice suit told Mommy she was going to be the new boss when Mrs. Margaret leaves. I heard him talking to her this morning." My heart stopped completely. The quick chat Margaret had had with me that morning, the one I'd interpreted as mere encouragement before the presentation, had been much more than that. Leo, who had arrived earlier than I expected and was playing near Margaret's office, had overheard a conversation that even I hadn't fully understood. Richard Hartwell had made the offer. I was being promoted to department manager. Mark paled in a way I'd never seen before, as if all the blood had instantly drained from his face. His hands, which seconds before had been gesturing confidently as he presumably recounted his triumphant version of the meeting, began to tremble visibly. I watched, fascinated despite my own shock, as the full realization hit Mark like a runaway train. He had just publicly, cruelly, and calculatedly humiliated the woman who would become his direct supervisor. Not only that, but he had done it in front of the boardroom, demonstrating exactly the kind of toxic, destructive behavior no company wants in its upper echelons. The fear in his eyes was palpable, not just fear of reprisal, but the genuine terror of someone realizing they may have destroyed their own career in a moment of blind arrogance. I don't," he stammered, completely speechless for the first time since I'd known him. The colleagues around us began to whisper, the sound growing like a wave spreading throughout the office. Linda Chen, who had emerged from a meeting and witnessed the final part of the revelation, stopped in the middle of the hallway with an expression of utter surprise. The news of my promotion, which should have been announced in a controlled and diplomatic manner, was now spreading through the office like wildfire, and Mark was at the epicenter of his own destruction. Leo, still unaware of the earthquake he had caused, looked around with growing curiosity as he realized that all the adults had stopped moving and talking. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked, his small voice echoing in the tense silence that had settled over the office. It was this innocent question that finally brought me back to reality. My son, trying to protect his mother from the cruelty he had witnessed, unaware that he possessed information that would completely change the power dynamics in our workplace, was now at the center of a situation he could not comprehend. I quickly approached, placing my hand on his shoulder in a protective gesture, and looked directly at Mark, who was still processing the magnitude of his mistake. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in hours: power. Not the kind of power that comes from position or title, but the power that comes from truth, justice, and the realization that the universe sometimes has its own sense of balance. Mark Peterson, who had spent the last 3 years building his reputation on the wreckage of other people's trust, who had publicly humiliated me just an hour earlier, was now literally shaking with fear before a 7-year-old who had spoken the truth without understanding its power. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with possibility, as everyone in the office waited to see what would happen next. And for the first time in my career at Hartwell & Associates, I felt completely, unequivocally, in control. The silence that followed Leo's revelation seemed to stretch on for an eternity, but in reality, it lasted only a few seconds before corporate life resumed its course, now charged with a completely different energy. I watched Mark try to compose himself, his hands still trembling slightly as he forced a smile that failed to hide the panic in his eyes. "Well, this is a wonderful surprise," he managed, his voice sounding forced and artificial. "Congratulations, Rachel. You certainly deserve this opportunity." The words tumbled from his mouth like glass being chewed, each syllable a confession of his own strategic error. Around us, colleagues began approaching with hesitant greetings, some genuine, others clearly calculated by people quickly recalibrating their political allegiances in the face of the new reality. Linda Chen approached with a professional smile and said, "Rachel, I imagine Richard wants to talk to you about next steps. Congratulations on the promotion." Her tone was cordial, but I could see the careful assessment in her eyes, as if she were trying to determine what kind of leader I would be. In this moment of public recognition, I felt a complex mix of emotions. The pain of humiliation still burned in my chest, but something new was being born, a spark of determination I had never felt before. I took Leo by the hand, my inadvertent protector and innocent catalyst for justice, and walked with him back to my desk as I processed the magnitude of what had just happened. My son had not only exposed Mark's cruelty but had revealed a truth I myself hadn't fully grasped. The morning conversation with Margaret hadn't just been encouragement, it had been the official communication of a decision that would fundamentally change my life. Richard Hartwell, apparently impressed with my work over the years, had chosen me to take over management of the department when Margaret retired. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Mark had humiliated me in front of the boardroom on the very day I found out I would become his boss. I sat in my chair, pulled Leo close and whispered, "Thank you, my little hero. You don't know what you just did, but it was a very important thing." Leo smiled with that purity only children possess and said, "I just wish he would stop being mean to you, Mommy." In that moment, I felt crystal clear about who I wanted to become as a leader, as a woman, as a mother. The humiliation of an hour ago hadn't faded, but now it served as fuel for something much greater. Mark spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of visible anxiety that would be almost comical if it weren't so revealing of his true nature. I watched him, now with completely different eyes, trying to navigate the new dynamic he had created through his thoughtless cruelty. He eyed me sideways, as if trying to determine if I was the kind of person who would seek immediate revenge or be magnanimous enough to forgive his public transgression. What he didn't understand, and what I was only beginning to grasp, was that my response would be something completely different from what he might have expected. It wouldn't be revenge or simple forgiveness, but something far more powerful: ruthless competence. I saw Mark try to approach my desk several times throughout the afternoon, clearly struggling to find the right words for an apology that might repair the damage he had done to himself. Each attempt ended with him retreating, realizing that anything he said now would only further underscore his precarious position. The power dynamics had shifted so dramatically and suddenly that he was completely lost, like an actor who forgot his lines mid-play. Observing his psychological disintegration gave me a new perspective on how power truly works, not through cruelty or manipulation, but through genuine competence and unwavering integrity. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Richard Hartwell personally appeared at my desk, something I'd never seen before in my 8 years at the company. He was accompanied by Margaret Sullivan, both of them wearing expressions that mixed congratulations with a hint of curiosity about how I'd handle the day's events. "Rachel," Richard said in that deep voice that commanded instant respect, "I imagine you have some questions about this morning's conversation." He glanced briefly at Leo, who was coloring quietly next to my desk, and smiled. "It seems we have a future negotiator in the family. He certainly has impeccable timing." Margaret laughed softly and added, "Richard wanted to make the official announcement tomorrow, but circumstances have changed our schedule a bit." They invited me to a private meeting in Richard's office, where I spent the next 40 minutes discussing the details of my new position, transition timelines, and expectations for my first 90 days as manager. Throughout the conversation, I maintained a professionalism that surprised even myself, considering that just hours earlier I'd been publicly humiliated. When Richard asked how I intended to handle the delicate situation of what had happened during my presentation, I responded with a calmness that came from somewhere deep within me, with professionalism, transparency, and a focus on results. Personal conflicts cannot interfere with team productivity. The real revelation came when I got home that night and finally had time to fully process the day's events. After making dinner for Leo and helping him with his homework, I sat in the living room of our small apartment and allowed the day's emotions to finally hit me in their entirety. The pain of humiliation was still there, but there was something stronger growing alongside it, a fierce determination I had never felt before. For years, I had accepted my invisibility as the price of keeping my job and supporting my family. I had tolerated the appropriation of my ideas, the lack of recognition, and the subtle condescension that permeates many corporate environments for women like me. But something fundamental had changed. Mark's cruelty had been a catalyst, and Leo's innocent revelation had been the spark that lit a flame I hadn't even known existed within me. I would no longer be the invisible woman working in the shadows, waiting for recognition. I would be a leader who demonstrated competence through actions, who built success through integrity, and who proved that true strength comes not from the ability to humiliate others, but from the ability to elevate everyone around you. Mark Peterson had given me an unintended gift. He had shown me exactly the kind of leader I didn't want to be, and in doing so, he had completely clarified the kind of leader I would become. Leo was taking a shower when I received an unexpected call from Margaret Sullivan. Her voice was warmer than I'd ever heard it, stripped of its usual professional formality. "Rachel," she said, "I wanted to call to apologize for what happened in the meeting today. I should have interrupted Mark immediately." I was surprised by the openness and vulnerability in her voice. "Margaret, you don't need to apologize. These situations are delicate." "No," she interrupted me. "We need to speak clearly about this. What Mark did was unacceptable, and my inaction was equally problematic. You showed a grace today that deeply impressed me." She paused before continuing, "Richard and I have discussed the day's events, and we want you to know that your response to the situation has only confirmed our conviction that you are the right person for this position. Leadership isn't just about technical competence, it's about character under pressure." Her words were like balm for wounds I hadn't even known needed healing. "Thank you, Margaret. That means a lot to me." "There's one more thing," she continued. "We want to expedite your transition to the management position. Instead of waiting until the end of the year, you'll officially take over next Monday. It's time for a change, and frankly, after what happened today, the company needs your leadership as soon as possible." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, genuine hope mixed with an unshakable confidence in my own abilities. That night, after Leo fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and began to outline my vision for the department. It wouldn't just be about taking control or demonstrating authority, it would be about creating an environment where competence was recognized, where genuine collaboration was valued, and where toxic behaviors like Mark's simply couldn't thrive. I reflected on the perfect irony of the situation. Mark had attempted to destroy me professionally at the very moment I was being elevated to a position where his attempted destruction would become the clearest possible evidence of his unsuitability for any leadership role. He had orchestrated his own downfall with a precision that would be impressive if it weren't so self-destructive. I wrote in my notebook, "Leadership is not about power over others, but about empowering others. It is not about being feared, but about being respected. It is not about eliminating threats, but about transforming challenges into opportunities for growth." As I wrote, I felt the last resistance of the invisible woman I had been dissolved completely. Tomorrow I would begin a new phase of my life, not just as a manager, but as the version of myself I always had the potential to be. Mark Peterson had given me the final push I needed to become who I truly was. And for that, strangely, I was almost grateful. On Wednesday morning, I arrived at the Hartwell and Associates office a completely different person than the one I'd left on Tuesday. It wasn't just the knowledge of my promotion that had changed my perspective, but a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and how I positioned myself in the corporate world. I walked the halls with the erect posture of someone who had finally understood their own worth, greeting colleagues with a genuine confidence that radiated from within. The buzz of the previous day's events still echoed through the office. Hushed conversations that stopped abruptly as I passed, curious glances trying to decipher how I would handle my new position of power. Mark arrived 15 minutes after me, and it was immediately obvious that he had spent a sleepless night strategizing how to deal with this new reality. His appearance was impeccable, a more expensive suit than usual, his hair perfectly coiffed, his shoes polished to a shine, as if a flawless visual presentation could somehow compensate for the magnitude of his strategic error. When our eyes met for the first time that morning, I saw something I'd never seen before in Mark Peterson's eyes, genuine fear mixed with desperate determination. He gave me a smile so forced and artificial it was painful to watch. "Good morning, Rachel. How are you feeling today?" His voice carried an exaggerated warmth that sounded like a poorly rehearsed performance. The transformation in Mark's approach was so dramatic it was almost comical. The man who had publicly humiliated me with cruel arrogance on Tuesday now behaved as if we were best friends who had lost touch for a while. During the morning, he'd stopped by my desk at least 6 times, each visit accompanied by some transparent pretext: a question about an old project, a comment about the weather, an offer to get coffee. "Rachel, I was thinking about your presentation yesterday," he said during one of his forays, his voice carefully modulated to sound reflective and regretful. "You know, after further reflection, I think perhaps I was, well, maybe a little too critical. Your insights were really interesting." The word, interesting, rolled off his tongue like a profound compliment, when we both knew that on Tuesday he had used that very word as a weapon to belittle my work. I watched this performance with a mixture of fascination and disgust, seeing clearly through the mask of false cordiality he had constructed overnight. His transparency was almost insulting, as if I were naive enough to believe his personality had magically transformed in 24 hours. Every word, every gesture, every smile was calculated with a desperate precision that only further highlighted his fundamentally dishonest nature. What struck me most was how Mark managed to maintain this charade for days without seemingly realizing how obvious it was to everyone around him. Colleagues who had witnessed his cruelty on Tuesday now watched his attempts at cordiality with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. During a team meeting on Thursday, I witnessed one of the most awkward moments of false camaraderie I had ever seen in my career. Mark, who traditionally dominated these meetings with his arrogant presence, now behaved like an eager-to-please subordinate. "Rachel brings up an excellent point," he said repeatedly, agreeing effusively with every comment I made, even when my observations were basic or routine. "That's exactly the perspective we needed," he added, nodding vigorously as if my comments were profound revelations. His former colleagues, those who used to laugh at his jokes and support his initiatives, now watched him with a look of secondhand embarrassment. Susan Mitchell, a senior analyst who has worked with us for over a decade, came to me after the meeting and whispered, "Rachel, it's almost painful to watch. He's trying so desperately to make amends that he's humiliating himself." Her observation perfectly captured the comic tragedy of the situation. Mark was so focused on undoing the damage he'd done to himself that he failed to see how his attempts at reparations only further highlighted his opportunistic and manipulative nature. But Mark's deceit wasn't limited to excessive praise and forced cordiality. I quickly realized he was developing a more sophisticated strategy to protect his position, an approach that combined public flattery with subtle political maneuvering designed to undermine my authority before I even officially took office. During hallway conversations, he began planting seeds of doubt about my management experience, always indirectly and seemingly sympathetically. "Rachel is brilliant technically," I overheard him say to a group of colleagues near the water cooler, "but managing people is a completely different challenge. I hope she receives adequate support during the transition." His words were carefully chosen to sound like genuine concern, but the subtext was clear, questioning my leadership capabilities. On another occasion, I caught him suggesting to Linda Chen that it might be prudent to implement a period of intensive mentoring for me, since I was jumping straight from technical analysis to management with no intermediate experience. Watching these maneuvers was a valuable education in how corporate politics really works, not through direct confrontations, but through strategic whispers and seemingly legitimate concerns that undermine trust almost imperceptibly. Mark was trying to create a narrative that would see my promotion as a risk that needed to be mitigated, positioning himself as the voice of reason and experience that could guide my troubled transition. Mark's most insidious strategy, however, was his attempt to hijack new projects and ideas to demonstrate his indispensability. I noticed he was carefully monitoring my schedule and conversations, looking for opportunities to insert himself into initiatives that could give me additional visibility. When Margaret mentioned during a meeting that the board was interested in a technology optimization proposal, Mark immediately offered to collaborate with me on developing the concept. "Rachel and I could make a perfect team for this," he suggested with calculated enthusiasm. "My implementation experience combined with your analytical expertise could produce something truly exceptional." It was the same tactic he had used on me for years, but now I could clearly see it for what it was: an attempt to parasitize the work of others to build his own reputation. I politely declined his offer, explaining that I preferred to develop the proposal independently first, before seeking collaborations. The look of frustration that crossed his face for a split second before being replaced by his forced smile was revealing. In that moment, I understood that Mark wasn't just trying to protect himself. He was actively working to undermine my nascent authority in a way that looked like constructive collaboration. It was a form of corporate warfare I'd never experienced as a target, but one I could now recognize and neutralize. By the end of the first week after the revelation, Mark's deceit had become so pervasive and obvious that it was creating a palpable discomfort throughout the department. Colleagues began to avoid him, not out of malice, but because their interactions had become artificial and uncomfortable. The confident, charismatic Mark who had dominated the office's social dynamics had been replaced by an anxious, calculating version who measured every word, every gesture, every facial expression. I watched him during a Friday meeting, desperately trying to recreate the casual dynamic he used to have with the team, but every joke felt forced, every comment rehearsed. It was like watching an actor trying to play a version of himself, but failing because he could no longer access the genuine confidence that had made his previous performance convincing. What surprised me was discovering that, instead of feeling satisfaction at his downfall, I felt a kind of anthropological pity, as if I were observing a specimen that had lost its ability to adapt and was fighting against extinction. Mark had built his entire professional identity on a persona that was now completely discredited, and he had no authentic reserves of character to draw upon. Watching this disintegration gave me a new perspective on the importance of authenticity in leadership. When you build your success on a false foundation, any seismic shift can topple the entire structure. The most revealing moment of the week came on Friday afternoon, when Mark made his most audacious attempt to reset our dynamic. He approached my desk with that exaggerated warmth that had become his trademark this week, but this time there was something different in his eyes, a determination that seemed almost desperate. "Rachel," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing an important confidence, "I wanted to talk to you about something that's been bothering me since Tuesday." I looked up from my work, curious to see what new strategy he had developed. "I think we both know things got a little tense during your presentation, but conflict can be productive when managed well." He paused, clearly waiting for some response that would indicate receptiveness to his approach. When I remained silent, he continued, "What I propose is that we use this as an opportunity to establish a truly strong partnership. You have the strategic vision, I have the operational expertise. Together, we could transform this department into something extraordinary." It was an alliance offer disguised as a business proposal, a final attempt to position himself as indispensable to my future success. I looked directly into his eyes and saw, for the first time, not the corporate predator who had tormented me for years, but a terrified man who had just realized he had destroyed his own position through his arrogance. In this moment of absolute clarity, I knew exactly how I would respond to his offer and how it would shape the future of our professional relationship. On Monday, 2 weeks after the revelation that changed everything, I walked into the Hartwell and Associates office no longer as Rachel, the invisible analyst, but as Rachel Mitchell, Strategy Department Manager. The weight of this transformation lay not just in the title or the physical move to Margaret's office, but in the responsibility I now carried for the professional destinies of 16 people, including Mark Peterson. Over the weekend, I had spent hours studying performance profiles, analyzing ongoing projects, and developing a clear vision for the first 90 days of my tenure. My desk now offered a panoramic view of the department, a literal and metaphorical perspective that allowed me to observe dynamics previously invisible to me. When I arrived at 7:15, an hour before the team's usual start time, I found the office still empty, with only the low hum of computers and the soft glow of automatic lights to accompany me. I sat in the chair that until recently belonged to Margaret Sullivan and felt a mixture of humility and determination that would define my approach to leadership. In my new environment, with photographs of Leo framing my workspace, I began finalizing the document I would present to the team about our new direction. It wouldn't just be about operational changes, but about a fundamentally different philosophy of how to conduct business, treat people, and achieve results. At 8 o'clock sharp, when the first colleagues began arriving, I was fully prepared for the day that would set the tone for my entire tenure. The first team meeting under my leadership was scheduled for 9 a.m., and I watched through the glass walls of my new office as each team member arrived with a visible mix of curiosity and apprehension. Mark arrived exactly 5 minutes early, a punctual behavior I had never observed before, clearly an attempt to demonstrate professionalism in front of his new supervisor. He avoided looking directly at my office, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he compulsively checked his papers, organizing and rearranging documents that probably didn't need organizing. Susan Mitchell waved to me through the glass wall with an encouraging smile that gave me added strength. David Chin, our data analytics specialist, seemed genuinely optimistic about the leadership change, having worked with me on several projects where his contributions were recognized in a way Margaret rarely did. When I entered the conference room at precisely 9 o'clock, the silence that descended was unlike any I had experienced before, not the silence of people waiting to be directed, but the silence of a team waiting to discover what kind of leader I would be. I positioned myself at the head of the table that had so often intimidated me as a spectator, and felt a deep calm that came from the certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice clear and confident. "I'm excited to share with you my vision for our department and, more importantly, to hear your perspectives on how we can grow together." The presentation I gave that morning was completely different from the one Mark had sabotaged 2 weeks earlier. This time, I wasn't trying to prove my worth or impress superiors. I was setting expectations, defining standards, and inviting my team on a collaborative journey toward excellence. "My leadership philosophy is simple," I explained, scanning every face around the table. "Merit-based recognition, transparency in all communications, and mutual accountability for our successes and failures. I saw Mark visibly swallow when I mentioned mutual accountability, likely interpreting it as a veiled threat. In reality, it was simply a statement of principles that would apply uniformly to everyone. Each of you was chosen for this team for your unique skills. My job is not to micromanage, but to remove obstacles that prevent you from shining. Over the next 30 minutes, I outlined structural changes we would implement: weekly one-on-one feedback meetings, rotating monthly presentations where each team member would have the opportunity to lead discussions about their projects, and a transparent evaluation system based on measurable objectives. There will be no favorites here, I declared, looking briefly but directly at Mark. There will be only performance, collaboration, and integrity. When I finished, the silence was followed by thoughtful questions and constructive suggestions that demonstrated the level of talent our team truly possessed when properly directed and valued. What surprised the team most, especially Mark, was my response when David Chin directly asked how I would handle past conflicts within the department. Everyone in the room knew he was referring to the presentation incident, and I could see Mark stiffen in his chair, preparing for what he likely expected to be his public sentencing. Conflicts happen in any workplace, I replied calmly. What matters is not avoiding them, but how we grow from them. Let's move forward with a clean slate, focused on what we can achieve together. Mark looked simultaneously relieved and confused, clearly not expecting such a magnanimous approach. This means, I continued, that all of you will be evaluated solely on your performance from this day forward. The past informs, but does not define, our future. It was a statement calculated to establish my moral authority while removing any unnecessary drama that might distract the team from our goals. Susan Mitchell smiled broadly, clearly impressed by my mature approach. What Mark didn't immediately grasp was that my magnanimity wasn't weakness, but a display of strength. I was confident enough in my leadership that I didn't need retaliation or any drama. Establishing this dynamic from day one created an environment where competence was the sole criterion for success, which, ironically, would have put Mark in a far more precarious position than any direct punishment could have. In the weeks following my official assumption of the role, I implemented changes that fundamentally transformed the culture of our department. I instituted what I called radical transparency. All projects were discussed openly, all contributions were documented and credited appropriately, and all major decisions were explained with full rationale to the team. It was the exact opposite of the culture of idea appropriation and politicking that had allowed people like Mark to thrive. I established a cross-mentoring system where senior team members worked directly with junior analysts, creating development opportunities that benefited everyone involved. I reorganized project assignments based purely on competencies and interests, not politics or favoritism. Susan Mitchell, who had been consistently underutilized under Margaret, flourished when given responsibilities that matched her superior analytical skills. David Chin took the lead on our technology modernization, a project that had been delayed for years due to passive resistance from people who feared change. Most importantly, I created a culture where questions were encouraged, where admitting uncertainty was seen as professionalism, not weakness, and where genuine collaboration was rewarded over self-promotion. Mark watched these changes with a growing sense of unease, realizing that the environment that had enabled his rise based on charm and manipulation was being systematically dismantled and replaced by one where only genuine competence would be valued. The true test of the new dynamic came during our first major project under my leadership, a comprehensive proposal to modernize Thomson Industries processes, ironically an evolution of the project Mark had sabotaged weeks earlier. This time, I structured the work as a truly collaborative effort, with each team member responsible for specific aspects within their areas of expertise. Mark was assigned to operational implementation analysis, an area where he claimed significant experience. During the first few weeks, I observed his performance with scientific interest, curious to see how he would function in an environment where he couldn't appropriate the work of others. The results were revealing. Without access to the ideas and insights of more talented colleagues, Mark produced analyses that were competent but not exceptional, the work of someone who had relied so heavily on external sources that he had lost the capacity for independent innovation. More troubling still, he began to show signs of frustration when his contributions didn't generate the automatic recognition he had become accustomed to receiving. During progress meetings, I could see his growing agitation when David Chin or Susan Mitchell presented brilliant insights that were genuinely theirs, receiving well-deserved praise that Mark clearly felt should be directed at him. It was like watching someone who had become addicted to a particular drug, undeserved recognition, being forced to function without it. The realization that Mark was fundamentally mediocre when deprived of his ability to leech off the work of others was simultaneously satisfying and slightly depressing. 6 weeks after taking the job, I received a formal review from Richard Hartwell and Linda Chen on my performance as a new manager. The meeting took place in the boardroom that had twice been the site of defining experiences in my career, first as the site of my humiliation, then as the site of my unexpected promotion. This time, I walked in with a calm confidence that reflected not only my new position but the personal transformation that had occurred during these intense weeks of leadership. "Rachel," Richard began, "the results under your management have been impressive. Productivity has increased 17%, team morale has reached levels we haven't seen in years, and the quality of work has noticeably improved." Linda Chen added, "Most importantly, we've received extremely positive feedback from clients about the new collaborative approach to their projects." Thomson Industries specifically mentioned the difference in the quality of communications and the depth of analysis. It was gratifying to hear these endorsements, but what made me most proud was knowing that these improvements came from creating an environment where everyone could thrive based on genuine merit. "There is one issue we need to discuss, however," Richard continued, his expression becoming more serious. "We've received some observations about Mark Peterson. His performance seems to have declined since his transition to new management." I took a deep breath, knowing this moment would come eventually. "Mark is a competent employee when properly directed," I replied carefully. "The question is whether our new work culture is compatible with his professional style." It was a diplomatic way of expressing what we were all beginning to realize. Mark Peterson was becoming a problem that even my magnanimous leadership couldn't solve indefinitely. Mark Peterson's frustration manifested itself in increasingly desperate and self-destructive ways during the weeks following his board review. I watched with a mixture of anthropological fascination and professional sadness as a man who once exhibited predatory confidence now slowly disintegrated in the face of a reality he could neither manipulate nor control. His expectation of direct retaliation had given way to something far worse for someone of his nature, growing irrelevance in an environment where genuine competence was the only currency that mattered. Mark had built his entire professional identity on the ability to shine through the demeaning of others, to appropriate others' successes, and to navigate corporate politics through charm and manipulation. My transparent, merit-based leadership approach had removed all these tools from his arsenal, leaving him exposed as fundamentally mediocre when forced to rely solely on his own capabilities. During meetings, I could see the frustration growing in his eyes as his contributions were evaluated by the same rigorous standards applied to everyone else, and as his insights consistently proved inferior to those of colleagues he had traditionally considered less talented. It was like watching someone who had spent years using unnecessary crutches try to walk without them, only to discover that his legs were atrophied by dependence. The gradual realization of his own inadequacy was transforming Mark into a toxic, desperate version of himself. The first serious manifestation of his sabotaging behavior came during the Thomson Industries project, when I discovered that Mark had deliberately omitted crucial information during a client meeting. I learned of the incident through a direct phone call from James Thompson, the client company's CEO, who expressed confusion about discrepancies between reports I had submitted and information Mark had shared during an enlightening phone conversation he had initiated without authorization. "Rachel," James said, his voice carrying genuine concern, "Mark called me yesterday saying there were some significant problems with the financial projections you presented, but when I review the documents you sent, I can't identify those issues." My stomach sank as I realized what had happened. Mark had contacted our most important client to sow seeds of doubt about the quality of our work, apparently hoping to create a crisis he could then resolve, positioning himself as the savior and simultaneously undermining my credibility. It was a strategy so transparently desperate it bordered on amateurish, but potentially devastating to our relationship with the client. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone with James, patiently explaining every aspect of our analysis, providing additional documentation, and rebuilding the trust Mark had tried to erode. During this conversation, I didn't mention Mark's behavior directly, but James was savvy enough to infer what had happened. "Rachel, I think you may have some internal issues to work through," he said diplomatically before hanging up. The sabotage intensified when Mark began making strategic mistakes in his contributions to ongoing projects, seemingly calculated to create problems that could be attributed to my inadequate oversight. While preparing a proposal for a potential client, I discovered that Mark had used outdated data in his implementation analysis section, data he knew was obsolete because he had been present at the meeting where updated information was distributed. When I confronted him about the error, he offered a rehearsed-sounding excuse. "Oh, sorry, Rachel. I was working with so many different data points that there must have been a mix-up with the versions." His tone was apologetic, but his eyes held barely concealed satisfaction, as if he expected me to explode or react emotionally, providing him with evidence of shaky leadership that he could report to others. Instead, I maintained absolute professional calm. "No problem, Mark. Everyone makes mistakes. Please revise your section using the correct information by the end of the day." His expression of disappointment at not having provoked a more dramatic reaction was almost comical. I worked late that night, not only correcting his deliberate errors but also implementing a cross-checking system that would make it impossible for similar errors to go unnoticed in the future. What Mark failed to realize was that each amateurish sabotage only highlighted my leadership skills under pressure and my ability to transform problems into better systems. Mark's attempts to discredit my leadership through hallway conversations became so frequent and predictable that colleagues began voluntarily reporting his comments to me. Susan Mitchell was the first to approach me with information about the concerns Mark was expressing about my management. "Rachel," she said during one of our weekly feedback meetings, "I think you should know that Mark has been making some comments that don't reflect the reality we observe on a daily basis." She recounted how Mark had suggested to several colleagues that I was micromanaging the team and that my management inexperience was creating unnecessary tensions. "The ironic thing," Susan continued, "is that I have never felt more respected or productive in all my years here. People aren't buying his narrative." David Shin echoed similar observations, mentioning that Mark had tried to recruit allies by questioning my technical competence and suggesting that management had made a mistake in promoting me. "He's trying to create a perception that you're failing," David explained, "but the results speak for themselves. Our productivity has increased, morale has improved, and customers are happier. It's hard to argue with hard evidence." What impressed me most was discovering that my team was actively defending my leadership against Mark's subtle attacks, not because I asked them to, but because they genuinely believed in the direction we were headed. It was a more powerful validation than any formal evaluation could be. Mark's behavior reached a new level of toxicity when he began attempting to sabotage important presentations and meetings through helpful interruptions and questioning designed to create confusion. During a crucial board meeting where we were presenting our quarterly results, Mark implemented a strategy that was simultaneously subtle and destructive. As I was explaining our efficiency improvements, he raised his hand and said, "Sorry to interrupt, Rachel, but I think it's important to clarify some context for the board." His intervention sounded collaborative, but what followed was a series of questions designed to confuse simple issues and make it appear that our team was divided on methods and objectives. "Some team members have expressed concerns about the sustainability of these improvements," he said, without specifying who or what concerns, "and I think it would be irresponsible not to mention those concerns." It was a classic tactic of creating doubt through vague, unverifiable allegations. Richard Hartwell frowned, clearly not appreciating the confusing dynamic Mark was creating. I responded with absolute calm, "Mark, I'd like you to specify exactly which team members and what specific concerns, so we can address them directly." His failure to provide concrete details exposed his claims as hollow, but the damage to the presentation's flow had already been done. After the meeting, Linda Chin reached out to me privately and said, "Rachel, I don't know what's going on with Mark, but this kind of undermining needs to stop." Mark's self-sabotage peaked during what should have been his opportunity for redemption, an independent project I had specifically assigned him to allow him to demonstrate his capabilities without interference or forced collaboration. It was a feasibility analysis for service expansion, a straightforward project that matched exactly the type of work he claimed to do best. For 3 weeks, Mark worked on this project with what appeared to be genuine dedication, even displaying some of his old charm when discussing progress in weekly meetings. When it came time for the final presentation, I was genuinely hopeful that he could redeem himself and find a constructive role within our new team dynamic. What happened was simultaneously surprising and revealing. Mark delivered a presentation that was technically competent, but had clearly been plagiarized from multiple outside sources. Not only had he copied analyses from public industry reports without proper attribution, but he had incorporated insights word for word from competing consulting firm proposals. It was as if he were incapable of producing original work even when his career depended on it. The discovery of the plagiarism was accidental. David Chin recognized one of the analyses as identical to a report he had recently read, but once we began investigating, the extent of the intellectual appropriation became undeniable. Confronting Mark about this discovery would be the most difficult conversation I would have as a manager, but it would also be the one that would ultimately determine whether he had a future on our team. The plagiarism confrontation took place in my office on a Friday afternoon, when the rest of the team had already left and we could have a private conversation without creating unnecessary drama. Mark entered with a forced confidence that quickly faded when he saw the printed documents arranged on my desk, clear evidence of his unauthorized appropriations. "Mark," I began, keeping my voice professional but firm, "we need to discuss serious concerns about your feasibility project." I watched his face go through the predictable sequence of emotions: feigned confusion, anticipated denial, and finally resignation when he realized the evidence was irrefutable. "Can you explain how word-for-word analyses of 3 different sources ended up in your presentation without attribution?" His response was a masterclass in deflection and self-victimization. First, he tried to downplay the importance of the similarities, then claimed that citation standards were unclear, and finally suggested that I was being unfairly critical because I had an agenda against him. Each excuse only highlighted his fundamental inability to take responsibility for his actions. "Mark," I said firmly, "this isn't about standards or agendas. It's about intellectual honesty and professional integrity." At that moment, I saw something break in his eyes. The final realization that he had pushed his situation beyond any possibility of recovery. His attempts at sabotage, rather than destroying my leadership, had merely exposed his own character flaws in a way that no amount of charm or manipulation could overcome. The meeting ended with Mark leaving my office silently, both of us knowing that his time at Hartwell and Associates was rapidly approaching its end. The meeting that would seal Mark Peterson's fate was not called by me, but by Richard Hartwell, on a rainy Monday that seemed to portend definitive change. I received the summons the previous Friday, a formal email requesting my presence in the boardroom for a discussion of urgent departmental matters. Over the weekend, I had mentally processed every possible scenario, but something about the formal language of the invitation and its timing, just 3 days after my confrontation with Mark about the plagiarism, suggested that forces beyond my direct control were at work. I arrived at the meeting prepared to defend my team and my management, but found an atmosphere that was professional yet charged with a determination that indicated decisions had already been made. Richard Hartwell, Linda Chin, and Margaret Sullivan, who had been called out of semi-retirement for consultation, were present, their expressions serious but not hostile. "Rachel," Richard began without preamble, "we want to discuss the situation with Mark Peterson. We've received multiple reports of behavior that is inconsistent with our corporate values and detrimental to the workplace." I immediately understood that this meeting wasn't about evaluating my performance as a manager, but about formalizing a decision the board had reached independently. The justice I'd never actively sought was finally being administered by the company's own structures, validating my strategy of professionalism over revenge. Linda Chin opened a folder containing extensive documentation that revealed the true scope of the investigation that had been occurring parallel to the events I had directly witnessed. In the last 2 months, she explained, HR has received multiple complaints about Mark's behavior, ranging from inappropriate comments to deliberate undermining of team dynamics. The complaints were not just from our team, but from departments across the company, painting a picture of a behavioral pattern that extended far beyond the incidents I had witnessed firsthand. James Thompson had formally reported the unauthorized communication Mark had initiated, expressing concerns about professionalism and questioning whether Hartwell and Associates maintained adequate oversight of client relationships. 2 companies we had pitched during Mark's tenure had subsequently mentioned, through informal channels, that they had received confusing or contradictory information from different team members, raising doubts about our internal coordination. More concerning, Linda continued, our annual employee satisfaction survey showed a significant drop in morale and trust during the period when Mark was most active in undermining activities. The data was indisputable. Productivity metrics, client satisfaction scores, and team cohesion indicators all showed declines during periods of Mark's greatest influence and dramatic improvements under my leadership. It was as if the company had been conducting a controlled experiment in leadership styles, and the results unanimously favored transparency and integrity over manipulation and politics. Margaret Sullivan, with the perspective of someone who had managed the department for more than a decade, provided historical context that was particularly damning for Mark's case. In retrospect, she admitted, several incidents during my tenure that I had attributed to personality conflicts or communication breakdowns now appear to be part of a consistent pattern of toxic behavior. She revealed that Mark had been placed on performance monitoring twice during his tenure, incidents that had been kept confidential but now took on new significance given current developments. The most telling incident, Margaret continued, was when Sarah Hendricks left the company abruptly 2 years ago. At the time, she cited better opportunities elsewhere, but exit interview notes that I recently reviewed suggest that she felt undermined and marginalized by an unnamed colleague who consistently appropriated her work. My heart ached when I heard this. Sarah had been a brilliant analyst whose departure I had always questioned but had never connected to Mark's behavior. The pattern is unmistakable, Margaret concluded. Mark Peterson operates through a systematic destruction of colleagues' confidence and appropriation of their contributions. Under normal circumstances, this behavior can be subtle enough to avoid detection, but Rachel's leadership style of transparency and documentation has made these patterns impossible to ignore. It was a powerful validation of my approach, but also a tragic reminder of how many talented people had potentially left a company because of one individual's toxicity. Richard Hartwell then shared perspectives that revealed how Mark's behavior had impacted our company's reputation in wider industry circles. We conducted informal conversations with contacts at other companies where Mark had previously worked, he explained. The feedback was illuminating. Apparently, Mark had left his previous positions under circumstances that were diplomatically described as mutual agreement for new directions, but conversations with former supervisors revealed consistent patterns of problematic behavior. More immediately concerning, Richard continued, recent interactions with clients and industry partners have raised questions about our internal culture and professionalism. The Thompson Industries situation had been particularly damaging because James Thompson was well connected in the industry and had privately questioned whether Hartwell and Associates had adequate quality control over employee behavior. When a client starts questioning our basic competence because of one employee's actions, Richard said gravely, we have a problem that extends far beyond interpersonal conflicts. The realization that Mark's behavior had potentially damaged our company's reputation in ways that could take years to repair added a dimension to this situation that transcended simple personnel management. It was about protecting our institutional integrity and ensuring that our company culture remained aligned with our stated values of honesty, collaboration, and client service excellence. The decision to terminate Mark's employment had been reached unanimously by the board, but the timing and execution had been carefully planned to minimize disruption and ensure legal compliance. Rachel, Linda explained, we want your input on transition planning, but the decision itself is final. They outlined a comprehensive plan that included immediate termination with a severance package, legal documentation to protect against potential retaliation claims, and a communication strategy to inform clients and team members without creating unnecessary drama. "We appreciate that you maintained professionalism throughout this difficult period," Richard acknowledged. "Your ability to lead effectively despite deliberate sabotage demonstrated exactly the kind of character we want in management positions." The irony was not lost on either of us. Mark's attempts to undermine my leadership had actually provided a perfect contrast that highlighted my strengths and exposed his fundamental unsuitability for any position requiring integrity or collaborative spirit. They asked for my recommendation on how to handle notification to our team, and I suggested a simple, factual announcement that focused on moving forward rather than dwelling on past conflicts. "The best tribute to our team's professionalism," I argued, "would be to treat this transition as a normal business decision rather than a dramatic resolution to personal conflict." The actual termination meeting took place the following Wednesday, and although I was not present for that conversation, Richard briefed me afterwards about Mark's reaction. "He alternated between denial, anger, and attempts at negotiation," Richard reported. "There was no acceptance of responsibility for his actions, and multiple attempts to shift blame to others, particularly you." Mark had apparently argued that his behavior was a defensible response to unfair treatment, and that any problems were a result of management inexperience rather than his own professional misconduct. "Most telling," Richard continued, "when presented with specific examples of client complaints and documented instances of undermining behavior, his response was to minimize their significance rather than acknowledge their impact." It was final confirmation that Mark was fundamentally incapable of self-reflection or genuine change, qualities that are essential for anyone working in a collaborative environment. His departure was handled with clinical efficiency, security escort to pack personal belongings, immediate revocation of access credentials, and professional but firm communication that any future contact with company employees should be channeled through the HR department. "The entire process took less than an hour," Richard noted. In contrast to the drama that he created during his tenure here, his actual exit was remarkably quiet. There was something poetic about this anticlimactic ending. Mark Peterson, who had spent years creating unnecessary drama and conflict, left our company in silence, having revealed himself to be fundamentally irrelevant to our continued success. A week after Mark's departure, I was conducting our regular team meeting when I realized that the atmosphere in our department had undergone a transformation that was almost magical in its completeness. Conversations were more open, laughter came more easily, and people who had previously seemed guarded or cautious were contributing ideas with an enthusiasm I had never seen before. Susan Mitchell, during one of our one-on-one sessions, perfectly captured what everyone was feeling. "Rachel, it's like a cloud has been lifted. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending on just navigating around potential drama." David Shin mentioned that he had already started 3 new innovative projects that he had been hesitant to propose previously, fearing that they might be criticized or appropriated. "Now," he said, "I feel safe to actually think creatively again." The productivity metrics that Linda Chen shared with me 2 weeks later confirmed what I was observing qualitatively. Team output had increased by 23%, client satisfaction scores were at all-time highs, and employee retention indicators suggested that our department was finally operating as a genuinely collaborative environment. Perhaps most significantly, 3 former employees who had left during Mark's tenure reached out to inquire about potential opportunities to return, having heard through industry networks that Hartwell and Associates had undergone positive cultural changes. The vindication was complete, but more importantly, justice had been served not through revenge or retaliation, but through simple truth finally being allowed to surface. Mark Peterson had destroyed himself through his own actions, and in doing so, had inadvertently created space for something much better to flourish in his absence. 6 months after Mark Peterson's departure from Hartwell and Associates, I found myself sitting in the same cafe where I used to have lunch during my years of invisibility, but now with a completely transformed perspective on my life and career. What had begun as a devastating humiliation had become the foundation of a professional rise that surpassed even my wildest dreams. Our team had not only become the most productive department in the company, but had set new standards for collaboration and innovation that were being studied and replicated in other divisions. Richard Hartwell had offered me an additional promotion to Director of Corporate Strategy, a position that would put me in direct contact with the company's largest clients and give me influence over the strategic direction of the entire organization. Leo, now 8, frequently surprised me with mature observations about how Mommy is happier at work now, a childlike insight that captured a profound truth I myself was only beginning to fully grasp. It wasn't just that I had found professional success, but that I had discovered an authentic version of myself that integrated competence, integrity, and leadership in a way that felt natural and sustainable. Reflecting on this extraordinary journey, I realized that true transformation hadn't happened when I received external recognition, but when I finally stopped seeking validation from others and began validating my own worth through actions consistent with my principles. The most profound lesson from this experience came from the understanding that genuine justice rarely takes the form we expect or desire. For weeks after the initial humiliation, I had fantasized about dramatic scenarios where I would publicly confront Mark, where I would spectacularly prove his incompetence, where I would administer some kind of poetic retribution that would restore my wounded dignity. But the reality was much more subtle and, ultimately, much more satisfying. Justice arrived through the simple persistence of truth, through the natural consequences of toxic behavior being allowed to surface in an environment of transparency. Mark destroyed his own career not because I orchestrated his downfall, but because he was unable to function in a system where genuine competence was valued over manipulation and politics. My revenge, if it can be called that, was simply creating an environment where character mattered, where contributions were accurately attributed, and where toxic behavior could not thrive. The power of this approach lay not in its dramatic impact, but in its sustainability. I didn't need to carry anger or resentment because the system itself had validated justice. Leo's innocent revelation had been the catalyst, but the real resolution came through my own commitment to leading with integrity, even when that meant taking the harder path of professionalism over retaliation. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. Because authentic leadership is not a destination, but a continuous commitment to using whatever power you have to make the world a little better for everyone around you.